Rejuvenation by synthetic hormones. Investigations by Bhutanandi showed that the male sex hormone was a fat-soluble substance related to cholesterol. Recent work of Rosenheim in England showed that there was a chemical relation between cholesterol, ergesterol, bile, vitamin D, and the sex hormone, all having phenaphrine nucleus. Benjamin Harrow, writing on The Male Hormone, American Medicine, April 1935, says, quote, "One current hypothesis, by no means confirmed so far, but interesting as a working hypothesis, is that during the course of its metabolism in the body, cholesterol may, under normal conditions, give rise to sex hormones and the bile acids, but under abnormal conditions, may give rise to cancer-like producing substances." Unquote. Latest researches on the synthetic production of the male hormone by Rizika of Zurich started with cholesterol, since the male hormone is known to belong to the group of phenaphrines to which cholesterol belongs. A recent newspaper report, in New York Post, September 16, 1935, read as follows. Artificial hormone promises prolonged activity of male. Quote, extension of the male lifespan indefinitely without operation, rejuvenation and reinvigoration of the male reproductive glands, a definite check to deterioration of the body and mind, a hope for progress to normality for sexual abnormals previously considered beyond the help of physiobiologists. These prospects were being discussed with renewed optimism today as a result of the announcement at the American Chemical Society that the laboratories of Dr. L. Rizika of Zurich have succeeded in the successful art. Testosterone, 25 to 50 times more potent than any male hormone previously isolated, is the first of the hormones of testicular origin to be artificially produced. Testosterone, when present in sufficient quantity, ensures the proper functioning of the sex organs, glands of development, and maintenances of secondary sexual characteristics and instincts. The results of these researches point quite definitely that the action of the male sex hormone upon the body is intimately related to the chemistry of cholesterol. Now, it is significant that cholesterol is a primary constituent of the semen. The Steinach operation, by leading to an enforced retention of semen, brings about a corresponding enforced retention of cholesterol. May not the rejuvenative effects which follow the operation be due to the action of the conserved cholesterol upon the organism? This brings us to the interesting question as to whether the sex hormone is present in the external secretion, the semen, as many investigators claim. Is the sex hormone present in the semen? There are two opposing views concerning the nature of the sex hormone. One, that it is purely an internal secretion produced by the so-called interstitial cells, and hence is not present in the external testicular secretion, the semen, and the other, that it is produced by the seminiferous tubules, and is therefore present in the semen. We shall see that the latter view is the correct one. The question has been raised whether the rejuvenative effects which follow the Steinach operation, vasoligature, are not due to the fact that, the external passage of semen being thereby prevented, it is thus resorbed into the circulation, and in this way affects the general nutrition of the body. Steinach has attempted to explain these results as being due to the fact that the closure of the vas deferens causes an accumulation of seminal fluid within the closed end of the tube, which induces a pressure on the seminiferous tubules of the testicle, leading to a degeneration of its cells, and a proliferation of certain cells in the interstitial tissues between them, the so-called cells of Leydig, which he believes are the seat of production of the sex hormone. He attributed the rejuvenative effects following his operation to the increased production of sex hormones by the interstitial cells, which are thereby caused to proliferate. This view has been accepted by physiologists for some time, but later and more exact investigations by Teje, Voronov, Retterer, Walker, Krauss, and others have shown that it can no longer be maintained, and that the sex hormone is produced by not the interstitial cells, but by the generative cells of the testes. The trend of recent evidence points to the fact that the rejuvenative effects following Steinig's operation are due to the absorption into the circulation of products given off by the generative cells of the seminiferous tubules, whose retention is thus assured. Referring to Steinig's operation, Professor E.G. Lidson comments, quote, "Still less does it prove, when taken alone, that the internal secretion is not elaborated and eliminated with the semen by the seminiferous tubules, or that the tubules are not necessary to perfect sex development. Neither does absence or non-formation of spermatozoids mean that the elements of the semen are physiologically worthless. We are justified in suspecting that the internal secretion of the testes is in part eliminated by the semen. The marked improvement, so often noted in the nutrition of sterilized, not castrated, males, and resulting from continence, thus may be scientifically explained. The procreative elements of the testes themselves have a double secretive action, the internal secretion being elaborated by the true secretory glandular tissue. The internal secretion being elaborated by the true secretory glandular tissue." Unquote. Lidston, Impotence and Sterility. Later experiments have shown that while Steinig's experimental results were correct, his explanation of them was not. In 1921, the physiologist, Thiéget, repeated Steinig's operation on guinea pigs, and found that, though there was a degeneration of the seminiferous tubules and a proliferation of the interstitial cells immediately after the operation, later, a regeneration of the tubules occurred, and observed that the maximum rejuvenative effects occurred not when the tubules degenerated and the interstitial cells proliferated, but when the seminiferous tubules regenerated. This conclusion has been experimentally confirmed by Simmons, who found that, after exposing the testicle to X-rays, there was first a proliferation and then a degeneration of the interstitial cells, while the tubules first degenerated and then regenerated. Simultaneously with the regeneration of the tubules, the greatest rejuvenative effects occurred. Even Kammerer, Steinig's strongest proponent and popularizer, is forced to admit, quote, "The question is not yet solved whether a definite differentiation is possible between the glands that generate only external secretions and those which, being mixed glands, possess visible ducts, but at the same time pour the secretions directly into the blood or lymph. It is by all means possible that the generative tissue produces hormones together with sperm cells, and it is also possible that the interstitial tissue originates from atrophied generative cells. Some hold that rejuvenescence will show only after the regeneration of the generative tissue has commenced." Kammerer states that the effects of the Steinig operation are similar to those produced by continence. The operation is really a method of inducing enforced continence. Dr. Chakraborty, a Hindu physiologist, writes, quote, "It has been shown that the testicular internal and external secretions are only necessary for procreation, but they also sustain the energy of the nerve centers and the spinal cord, and are capable of endowing the individual with physical, nervous, and intellectual vigor." Professor Saju, the great American endocrinologist, in his work, The Internal Secretions and the Principles of Medicine, 1919, presents evidence to prove that the effects which have been attributed to an internal secretion of the sex glands are really due to the absorption into the circulation of substances contained within the external secretion, the semen, when this is retained. He bases his view on the observation that the sex glands and the adrenal glands arise from the same embryonic tissues, and that the testes contain adrenal rests, or vestiges of interrenal tissue. He writes, quote, "Analysis of the question has led me to suggest that the testicles did not produce a true internal secretion, but that the adrenal rests, interrenal tissue, which they contain, contribute to the elaboration of the sperm, and, more so ever, that when through sexual abstention of secretion is not used, it is taken up by the circulation, producing the effects of the adrenal secretion, in organic combination, upon the tissues at large, with the so-called internal secretion of the testicle identified as a product of adrenal rest in this organ, and recalling the action of the adrenal products upon oxidation, metabolism, the vascular tension, etc., we can understand the morbid effects of masturbation and excessive venery, particularly the debility, languor, mental torpor, and deficient growth in boys addicted to these habits. These symptoms coincide with those which, as we have seen, follow castration. On the whole, the above data seems to warrant the following conclusions. 1. There is no true internal secretion of the testes. The products of the epithelial and seminal cells which unitedly take part in the formation of seminal fluid being derived mainly from adrenal rests in these cells. 2. When seminal fluid is not discharged through coitus, masturbation, etc., that part of it contributed by the epithelial and seminal cells is added to the asset of adrenal products in the body at large. The most conclusive body of evidence that the sex hormone is produced by the seminiferous tubules, rather than by the interstitial cells, is that provided by Voronov and Retterer, whose experiments are now accepted by authorities as conclusive. In observing testicles after transplantation, they found no cell division in the interstitial tissue. This meant that the apparent increase in the number of interstitial cells observed by Steineck following vasoligature was due to the fact that these cells were derived from degenerating cells of the seminiferous tubules, and that the rejuvenative effects following the operation were due to the absorption into the circulation of products given off by the degenerating and later regenerating tubules. Examining the seminiferous tubules of dogs a year after vasoligature, Voronov and Retterer found that their epithelial cells still continued to generate spermatozoa. Though the interstitial cells were then greatly diminished, the animals displayed normal sex characteristics. This demonstrated that the sex hormone is formed by the generative cells, whose products continue to be formed and resorbed after the operation. Professor Forek, in his voluminous work, The Human Testes, writes, quote, "The interstitial gland internal secretion theory has not, however, gone unchallenged. The most recent histological researches rather denied the existence of an internal secretion affecting sex characters being due to the interstitial cells, and attribute such effects entirely to the work of the seminiferous elements proper of the testicles. Voronov and Retterer are the most prominent protagonists in this view." Unquote. Within recent years, the evidence in favour of the fact that the sex hormone is produced by the generative instead of the interstitial tissue of the gonads has become overwhelming. In a recent statement by the physiologist Kenneth Walker, Journal of Organotherapy, March to April 1929, he states that his investigations lead him to the conclusion that, quote, "the spermatogenous cells produce the internal secretion. Also, that the interstitial cells are merely trophic in their function and furnish the tubular with nutritive material." Unquote. The most authoritative statement on this subject appeared in an editorial of the Journal of the American Medical Association, November 9th, 1929, devoted to the question of the internal secretion of the testes. In this editorial, it is clearly stated that the old theory concerning the interstitial cells as the source of the sex hormones can no longer be maintained in the light of recent evidence pointing to the fact that the generative tissue produces the hormone. Speaking of the recent work of Krauss, 1928, on the interstitial cells, the editor remarks, quote, "What light does it shed on the function of the interstitial cells? Krauss's own conclusions are that the cells do not have the resorptive function ascribed to them by some, because they do not begin to multiply until toward the end of the stage of degeneration of tubular epithelium. He also denies a general endocrine activity in the sense that the interstitial cells act on the body as a whole and helps to determine the secondary sexual characteristics. This, he urges, is a function of the specific germinal cells. The chief function of the interstitial cells seems to be a trophic one, the furnishing to the germinal epithelium of specific nutritive substances necessary for normal spermatogenesis." Unquote. In the light of the above findings, there can be little doubt of the fact that the male sex hormone is contained within the semen, since it has been shown that it is produced by the seminiferous tubules. This would mean that the rejuvenative effects following the stynic operation were due mainly to resorption of the semen, whose outlet has been denied, as claimed by Professor Lidston, who again says, quote, "It is by no means improbable that the procreative elements of the testes themselves have a double secreting action, the internal secretion being elaborated by the true secretory glandular tissue, and is mainly taken up and distributed by the blood vessels of the organ, the excess escaping with the spermatoza. Consistently with this hypothesis, the internal secretion probably is constant, while the spermatoza-producing function is easily inhibited or destroyed, and the spermatoza doubtless are more or less intermittently produced, varying with sex stimuli and demand. We are justified in suspecting that the internal secretion of the testes is in part eliminated with the semen." Unquote. This leads to a biochemical explanation of the injurious effects of losses of semen through masturbation and sex excess, based on the fact that the sex hormone is withdrawn from the body in this manner, the effects being similar to deprivation of sex hormone through castration, as noted by Professor Saju. Concerning this point, Professor Lidston writes as follows, quote, "The author believes that normal nutrition and function of the various cell structures of the body largely depend upon normal quantity of sex hormone supply. Sexual excess, indeed all unphysiologic use of the sexual function, produce aberration of this exceedingly vital principle, either as to quantity or quality, or both. If this view be correct, the various phenomena which we term neurasthenia may be readily understood in a large proportion of cases. In view of the hormone theory, it is rather difficult to believe that either frequent masturbation or sexual excess can be harmless. When we consider the importance to the growing youth of a proper nutrition, which depends so largely on proper sex hormone supply, the habit of masturbation assumes rather more serious importance than is attributed to it. A lack of proper sex hormone supply in the female is particularly disastrous in its effects upon the nervous system. Incidentally, the effect upon her progeny is a matter for very serious consideration. The abundant supply of the hormone provided by the normal corpus luteum of pregnancy is not without its uses in fetal development, neither is it without its lessons for both profession and laity. In the author's opinion, the evil effects of sexual excess are due to several factors. First, exhaustion of sex hormone supply. Second, vitiation of sex hormone supply due to imperfect elaboration and possibly to emotional perversion of sex gland chemism. Third, the perversion of bodily nutrition in general as a secondary effect of defective supply and perverted quality of the sex hormone. Fourth, perversion of cell chemism, especially that of the secretory gland cells, by excessive emotional excitation. The author believes that the sex hormone is the most important of all in the nutritive hormone cycle, i.e., that it is the keystone of the nutritive arc, being the most powerful of all cell foods and stimulants of organic functional activity, this being especially true of the cerebrospinal and sympathetic nervous systems. If this view be correct, neurasthenia, with its attendant mental and physical exhaustion, may be, after all, in many cases, in its last analysis, merely a symptom of aberration of sex gland hormone production. Where the psychic conditions attending sexual act are favourable, a still more marked aberration of the sex hormone is naturally to be expected. This probably explains the wide variation in the effects of the performance of the sexual function, effects varying from what may be termed normal temporary lassitude to immediate, profound, and subsequently long-continued physical and mental exhaustion.